Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Making the Argument from our brand new studio. We still got a couple more things to adjust, to put on the walls, but we're just about done. So we wanted to let you know, no, we're not filming this from some exotic place. This is the new studio, and we're pretty happy with it. I want to thank everybody that put in the hard work to make it possible. Today, we're going to be asking a question about the relationship between India and the United States. Now, this relationship has been somewhat problematic in the past, especially during the Cold War, where India largely cozied up to the Soviet Union and Pakistan cozied up to the United States. Well, that has obviously changed since the fall of the Soviet Union, as well as the war on terror, where relationships with Pakistan become more and more strained, and relationships with India seem to be improving. However, very recently, Trump has announced that he is drastically increasing tariffs on India as a result of them purchasing oil from Russia. In fact, we pulled up an article here from our good friends over at Ground News where that's the headline: Trump's 50% tariffs on India for buying Russian oil take effect. Now, obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on India's economy at a time where we thought relationships were getting better, at a time where India being a member of BRICS and pushing them closer to Russia and China could foster problems. So why did the Trump administration think it was necessary? Well, you can dig even more into this article here on Ground News. Plus, find a number of links to other articles that are covering this from left, right, and center. Now, remember, Ground News is both a website and an app, and it curates all the latest stories and provides you with insight into who is covering the news and why they are covering it. So if, like us, you are a little tired of how other sites curate the news and want more transparency, go over to ground.news/MTA and get 40% off their Vantage plan. For just $5 a month, you can check out all of their many features and get unlimited access at ground.news/MTA. Go check it out. All right, let's get into it. So, just like always here on MTA, what we're going to do is we're going to frame the issue that we're talking about, get everyone on the same sheet of music. Then we're going to talk about the different perspectives. Where are these various players and actors coming from, and why are they potentially making the decisions they are? And then, of course, we'll end it up with our own conclusions. I'm glad to be in the studio with my co-host. To my right, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And to my left, which I don't know, is that accurate in real time? To my left, you're the left of me, right?
Some people will say yes. Some people will say no.
Our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines.
I like what you did with the place.
You like that? I like what we did with the place. Tina put in a lot of work here. So did Nate. A lot of other people. A lot of people to thank. Ren, Cody, many others.
Hamilton.
All right, Hamilton. Of course, Hamilton. Of course. When we look at this issue with India, why is this important to American viewers? Well, first of all, India is the most populated country in the world with about 1.4 billion people. Christian, you were pointing out just before we started today that India has a population that is greater than all 27 EU countries and the United States and the UK and Canada combined, plus about another 500 million. So when you take that all into consideration, that's enormous. India has roughly it's between 4 and 5 times the population of the United States.
They have 1 billion more people than us.
So that's pretty significant. Not to mention the fact that they occupy a region of the world that's important for a variety of reasons, from socioeconomic reasons to military reasons to strategic trade reasons. Not to mention that when you have that many people, you have the potential to be an economic powerhouse. Now, India, like I mentioned before, India during the Cold War sided more with the Soviet Union. That's gradually been changing since the fall of the Soviet Union, but especially recently, it seemed that Modi and Trump, Prime Minister of India, Modi, and President Trump had a pretty good working relationship. Which was important because India had been a part of BRICS. And for the people that don't know what BRICS is, BRICS was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So it was an acronym of those countries. And part of their goal was to increase stronger trade relations and ultimately set up an alternative currency to the United States dollar for the purposes of replacing the dollar, or at least providing competition to the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the reason why India was an important partner for that was for trade reasons, for manufacturing reasons, for population reasons. And one of the most interesting components of that was establishing a commodity-based currency. So the US dollar is a fiat currency, which gives the United States a great deal of power from an inflationary standpoint, whereas if they set up an alternative that was a commodity-based currency, it would provide a lot more stability within the currency, and it wouldn't just be up to the whims of the Chinese government or the Russian government or the Brazilian government or the Indian government. So for all of this, Trump seeking out closer relationships with India was very important, I would say, to the United States from a foreign policy perspective, on kind of like pulling them away from the sphere of influence of BRICS, of China, of Russia. Not to mention the fact that if you look at the relationship between China and India, it's been pretty bad for a long time. There's a lot of land disputes that are going on. There's a lot of clashes that have actually involved, people shooting at each other.
Well, no. Actually, a lot of times they're beating each other with sticks up in the Himalayas.
Well, there you go.
It's like a gentleman's agreement where they're like, we don't want this to escalate too much. So you're going to get your border guards and we're going to get our border guards and we're going to arm each other with sticks and then we're going to beat each other. I'm not kidding, by the way. This actually happens. But China and India have fought wars before.
Times when they are each like marching on each of their respective
That's India
sides.
and Pakistan.
Yeah. That's right.
India and Pakistan.
Yeah.
And they don't get along either.
Those are hilarious to watch those videos.
Yeah. They've done that continually since the 1950s, every single day.
It's like whose leg can lift higher when they march.
Yeah.
And
but they have these border disputes with China. China has seen them as a significant threat because India is also a nuclear power. So India has nuclear weapons. And so it appeared for a while that, again, things were going in a positive direction. You had Prime Minister Modi coming over to the United States, speaking very well of Trump on international news and on U.S. news. And now all of a sudden it seems to be crumbling, and crumbling pretty significantly because the United States being the biggest consumer nation in the world, the United States being the world's reserve currency, gives us a lot of power, especially with a country like India that has recently started to liberalize their economy. And by what we mean by that is they've started to reduce some of the regulations, reduce some of the controls that they had that really held back the Indian economy from properly developing. And this, combined with our strained relations with China, put India in a unique position to say, hey, a lot of the manufacturing that China is doing, a lot of the cheap manufacturing that China is doing, India could do a lot of that same work. And now we'd be doing it with a country where, again, neither China or India, we could argue on some level, can afford to alienate the United States as a trade partner. Their economies are far more reliant upon us than we are upon them. That doesn't mean that there isn't a negative impact to the United States by putting high tariffs on places like China and India. It's just that in the interim, it hurts them more than us. And so this is a huge move by Trump. This is basically, you almost knew that there was behind the scenes conversations going on between Modi and Trump, where Modi was like, look, if you continue to cozy up to China and the Russia, we can be your friend, we can be your economic friend, or we can be your economic India. And India apparently decided that they were going to call Trump on this. And that's caused the United States to retaliate economically, at least for right now. What are some of the other things that are leading to, problems with respect to India-U.S. relations at this stage in the game?
So this is interesting because when you go back far enough into the past, you brought this up briefly, that India was kind of quasi arrayed against the United States during the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, you had basically the collapse of the Indian economy in the 1990s. And in the 10 to 20 year period in the lead up to that, so from the 70s to the 90s, you had a generation of Indians. I wouldn't say that it was a huge number, but it was a decent, certainly in comparison to their country's population.
Yeah.
But you had a decent number of Indians that moved to Western countries, really actually between the 50s and the 90s. If you go far enough back in the UK and Canada, it was as early as the 50s. But in the United States, you can trace it back to the 60s and 70s.
And it's important to understand that a lot of the immigration you see happening to Western countries in general had to do with them being a part of the British Empire, part of the overall. And so if you were a country that was a part of the British Empire or part of the Commonwealth,
it was easier to move.
Immigration within those Commonwealth countries was significantly easier than, say, immigrating to other countries.
Yeah. And so you had a block of Indians that moved to the US, to Canada, to the UK, depending on the country, beginning in the 50s, in some cases earlier, but mostly beginning in the 50s through the 1990s. And when you look at that group of immigrants, in a way, it was actually a big challenge for people from a radically different culture and tradition to move to these Western countries and assimilate. And obviously not all of them did, but a good chunk of them did. When you look at, for example, some of the highest income earners in the United States are Indians.
Yeah.
They're Indian Americans. And a lot of them are second generation Indians, where it's like their parents were the ones who moved here, but they were born here and they've grown up here. Now, obviously, some people are going to listen to what I just said and say, okay, but assimilation is not just make a bunch of money, right? Like I could move to Japan and start a business and make a bunch of money, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I've assimilated to Japanese culture.
Sure.
The difference is that when you're such a small group compared to the overall population, and then you move into the country, there's a pressure for you to kind of integrate yourself into whatever that culture is. The analogy that I've brought up before is take a guy from Montreal and plop him into Honshu. There's a very good chance, even if he doesn't want to, that he will kind of keep his head down and integrate into Japanese culture, because he's one French Canadian in a country of 120 million Japanese people. Now, it's an even easier thing to do when he's like an otaku or he's a weeb, right? Or, he actually likes Japanese culture and he has the incentive to do it. Now, take the entire population of Quebec, the province, and plop it into Honshu.
Yeah.
Will all of the millions of Quebecois become Japanese? And obviously, I don't mean that like ethnically, but culturally, will they adopt Japanese culture for themselves? Of course not. We know that they won't, because look at what's happened in Canada.
Yeah.
Right? Like, no, they will be Quebec in Japan.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the first generation.
And let's just say something real quick, because Carl Benjamin brought this up once, and Carl Benjamin obviously has massive problems with the immigration system in the UK. But one of the things that he said is like, look, it's not unreasonable for somebody that is coming, especially from a culture which is so different from the one that you left, to seek out other people that share that culture. And we see this in the United States too. You go into San Francisco, or you have Chinatown, right? You go into other places, you'll have Little Italy, right? So it's not unusual for a people group to seek out other people with shared cultural traditions. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily like subversive to the overall culture. It really depends on what sort of culture is being imported and how well that culture can blend with the predominant culture within a particular society. And just so we define our terms here real quick, when I talk about culture, there's a broader definition from Bell that said that culture is society's attempt to come up with a coherent set of answers to the existential questions that we face throughout our lives. Put in more like simpler terms, culture is generally associated with the legal, religious, traditions within a society, the political traditions within a society. Essentially, it's a concept of worldview. And there's some worldviews that can be different in some respects, but share common threads. And so American culture has been predominantly defined by being English common law from our legal traditions, with obviously some American spins on that with respect to our own Constitution, Christianity, entrepreneurship, a strong belief in private property rights, a strong belief in individual rights.
A lot of Enlightenment era ideals.
Certainly. Well, yeah, but Enlightenment era ideals rooted in a Christian theology. Yes. And so there it wasn't Enlightenment in the same way. The French Revolution was based off of Enlightenment, and it came up with a very, very different result. And so that was kind of American culture: rugged individualism, strong sense of community, Christian in nature, and that could actually adopt a lot of other cultural trends or traditions or things as whatnot, as long as it was understood that at a fundamental level, we're a constitutional republic. We believe in private property rights. We believe in individual liberty. We believe in personal responsibility. These things are very, very important to us. And so provided that the cultural things that you were bringing with you didn't clash with those on a significant level, it was actually fairly easy to integrate into the United States. And you can even argue in places like the UK and whatnot. But part of that integration process included what you mentioned before, and it was this idea that that was the bargain, right? Like if you wanted to come and celebrate a particular religion, we have religious freedom, and we believe in religious freedom. If you wanted to come and you wanted to celebrate a particular holiday, okay, that was fine. We don't, there aren't going to be prohibitions on it. In fact, stores and areas where there's more people might cater to it more. But understand that we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate Thanksgiving, right? These are American traditions and holidays, and so on and so forth. All right, modes of dress, right? We weren't all that concerned with if you wanted to dress a little differently or whatnot. But the predominant dress was going to be this, and we're not going to be. Well, now we're starting to see notions of that change, and when you have significant numbers of the population come over, and why they're coming over matters, right? So. A lot of the people,
it's a combination of the mass migration. Because I brought up earlier, like the first generation of Indians that came to the US, Canada, and the UK were very small in number compared to what's come since then. And they also, a lot of them did not cluster in like ethnic enclaves.
Yeah.
They kind of dispersed around the country. And so you look at older generations of Indian immigrants in, say, the UK, they've adopted British style speech. Look at like Rishi Sunak as an example of this, who was born in the UK and he doesn't have an Indian accent, right? He sounds like if you were blind, right, and you hear Rishi Sunak speak, you might be mistaken for thinking that he's ethnically English.
Yes,
because
and that's an important thing to mention here, right? Is that there's what you might call ethnic nationalism, which is focused entirely on ethnicity. And then there's civic nationalism. And the idea is that there are certain countries that have developed such a strong civic nationalism that you can theoretically come from another country, and you will never be ethnically English, but you can definitely be, British or
but it only you were hinting at this earlier. It only works at very small numbers over a very large amount of time. And if the incentive structure is one that encourages integration and assimilation rather than I want money.
Yeah.
I mean, you were saying a second ago that one of the things that changed is, well, we went from saying you're going to come here because you want these principles or these opportunities. Well, there's another opportunity that exists, and that's the welfare state.
Yeah. It's important to understand how the welfare state motivates immigration. There's a lot of people that still come to the United States, legally and illegally, that are genuinely looking for opportunities, which is to say that they want to be able to work, and they don't want the fruits of their labor to be arbitrarily taken from them by their government, by cartels, by terrorist organizations, whatever it is. And for the vast majority of U.S. history, there was a reason why, one, we had a massive amount of territory. But there was also this motivation that nobody had an expectation that when I get to the United States, the government will take care of me. They had an expectation that when I get to the United States, the government will not oppress me. And that's a very, very different, that's a powerful motivation to come somewhere. If you're like, I am hardworking, I am entrepreneurial, I believe that I have to, proverbially pick myself up by my own bootstraps, then moving to a place that was both rich in opportunity because the government wasn't trying to micromanage your life or take your money or whatever else it was.
The default is that it doesn't hold you down in
one
place.
Yeah.
You're not locked into one place your whole life.
Exactly. But as the mindset in America, as we grew in wealth and power and prestige, and as the mindset in America changed, especially in academia and within the government, that now there was, a moral obligation to provide for people. Well, you change the incentive structure with respect to immigration. So now it's, well, I'm coming to the United States because they'll give me stuff. Well, again, if you are attracting people to your country because they love the underlying principles that allows them to work hard and succeed, that's a very different motivation than I'm attracting you to my country because I provide a culture which will A, take care of you through taxpayer expense, and B, will accommodate all of your cultural norms that you're bringing with you. And there's a big difference between being hospitable and accommodating. I can be hospitable. I can say you're welcome into my home. But the moment you come into my home, put your feet on my table, and start coloring on the walls, I'm kicking your ass out of my home because I'm not going to accommodate the behavior which disrupts the very conditions that made my home attractive in the first place. And we saw a radical shift as we started to become more left-leaning in our economic policy and our social theories. We started it, and I'm not talking about positive things like as was with civil rights. I'm talking about this idea of cultural relativism. Multiculturalism is something to encourage.
Not just encourage, also enforce.
And enforce.
In the case of Canada.
In the case of Canada.
And also the erasure of American culture and this idea that has been pushed through academia that there is no American culture, which is really funny because if you go other places,
they know what American culture is.
That America has a specific culture and maybe they hate it, maybe they don't like it, or maybe they envy it. Either way, they know we have our own culture. But for some reason within our own it's almost like, hey, we all speak with the same accent, so therefore to us we have no accent. It's not true. Someone else, in the UK would definitely think we have an accent, right? So
Nick, you were saying, like, right before we started recording, you were saying that something on the culture front about like, and please jump in because I'm gonna butcher this, but it was something like we were told for so long, you have to accept other cultures and you're not allowed to celebrate your own. In fact, you can't even recognize that there is one. And just something finally broke where there's now increasingly a critical mass of people in countries like the US, like Canada, like the UK that are like, no, I just reject your premise entirely.
Well, the problem is that preference for one's own culture is now turning into animosity toward other cultures, in part because we were told that we had to accommodate other cultures in our own country, but they didn't have to assimilate with ours. And that just seems, that is the simplest way to put it is that's unfair, right? We got tired of hearing about the ugly American that went over to other cultures and was loud and rambunctious and whatnot. And why don't you have respect for the other countries that you're going to? Now, here's the interesting part. If you look at a lot of Americans abroad, especially Americans that regularly travel, they're actually very respectful of the cultures that they go to, right? But you did have the ugly American, right? That was the thing. Well, what was the problem with the ugly American? The problem with the ugly American was you were going to a culture that was not your own, and you were simply imposing or demanding accommodation for American characteristics, traits, beliefs, ideas.
Yeah, like where are my vegan options?
Yeah. And so what were we all told? That made you an ugly American. Well, why are the very characteristics that make you an ugly American when you go abroad, right? It's something that you're supposed to put up with, adopt, celebrate, and accommodate when somebody comes over here. And so if we all agree that we should not be ugly Americans when we go over to another culture, well then why can't we insist that you don't be ugly wherever you came from when you come into an American culture?
So there's an overlay between the cultural dynamics of this and politics.
Yeah.
So we started this podcast talking about the tariff war. I think the tariff war is actually masking a much deeper divide that's going on. That actually goes back to, and I have the link for this, it goes back to this book that was published shortly after the end of the Cold War, Clash of Civilizations.
Yeah.
It was written by Samuel Huntington, and his argument was almost like the antithesis of Francis Fukuyama's end of history argument. So you had these two competing theses that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Union. One was The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama, where he argued liberalism, and we mean this in its all of its variants, classical liberalism, progressivism, modern liberalism. Liberalism, all the various different forms of it, is the kind of final stage of human development. It beat monarchy, it beat Nazism and fascism and imperial Japan, and then finally it defeated communism. And so the entire world will eventually become liberal democracies, and that will be the end of the story.
No, according to Christian, then it will defeat itself.
Well, no, but this is Francis Fukuyama's.
Yeah,
argument.
that's not Francis's thesis. Yeah. That's my thesis.
Yeah.
And I'm not the only one that came up with that, by the way, by no means. Well, there was a competing, I mean, they were writing this when I was an infant, right?
Yeah.
There's in the case of Fukuyama, he was writing it before I was even born. There's a competing thesis that emerged just a few years later, And Samuel Huntington argued, no, what's going to happen now is ideologies are going to give way to a clash of lifestyle and culture and belief.
Mm-hmm.
And that in some ways is much nastier than a war between ideologies, because now you're talking like ideologies are something you can arguably argue somebody into or out of.
Yeah.
You cannot argue somebody out of a cultural lifestyle or a existential worldview that is deeper than ideology.
I wouldn't say that you can't argue someone out of it. I would say that the degree to which they're willing to part with it increases significantly. The degree to which they're willing to fight for it or die for it increases significantly. Like
put it this way.
But to your point, when someone comes to me, all of our lives there's like these concentric circles, right? When you get close to the things that we identify with at our soul, those are the things we're least willing to part with, most willing to fight for, most willing to die for. All right. My ideas on tax policy are several concentric circles out from that. So theoretically, if you make a good enough empirical argument, a good enough logical argument on why the speed limit should be 75 instead of 55,
you're not going to go to war.
I'm not going to war over that, right? It's not like, no, like, I will now raise the cross. And you're like, no. But if you say, we're outlawing Christianity, I will fight. I will die for that. I will die for that. And so I think that Samuel Huntington's broader argument that, this, because it was another part of, I would argue, kind of the classical liberal tradition, or one offshoot of the classical liberal tradition, to minimize all of the other stuff, to minimize religion, to minimize cultural and social traditions, to minimize family traditions, and then to elevate these kind of civic traditions,
universal concepts,
is this is what defines us as a people. And what we have found out is, well, no, the vast majority of people on the planet do not associate themselves with that way of thinking. And even in the West, I don't associate myself with that way of thinking. I tell people, no, I am first a Christian. The rest of my worldview stems from that. And so this idea that, well, all that's gone now and that's all silly.
Yeah.
And now no. And I think Samuel Huntington has been proven correct.
I mean, one of the things that I've learned over the last several years is that, like, on the question of immigration, I was bringing up earlier, one of the things that was leading to more positive relations between the US and India historically was we, until recently, had actually relatively positive interactions with the Indians that we in the West had exchanges with. I said earlier, like, some of the highest income earners in the US are Indians. And these were, the first and second and even third generation. They came over and they did their best to integrate into the existing society. And they pursued what Calvin Coolidge said was the business of America, which is business.
Yeah.
They became doctors, they became engineers, they became
entrepreneurs, business owners.
Like, when you look at Silicon Valley, there's quite a few Indian billionaires in the US.
Yeah.
Some of them, by the way, are much more red-pilled than others. I know this because some of them like some of my tweets, let's put it like that. But
well, and when you also look at it too, is when they came in. So again, if you look at American culture and Christianity being kind of like a foundational theological premise in the United States, when you had Indian people coming over, they integrated very well into a society where the polite, hardworking, entrepreneurial, and there was no attempt to engage in any sort of like heavy-handed proselytization of like trying to get Hinduism to replace Christianity.
No, it's even more than that. It was not an attempt to replace the existing culture. So, like, Suella Braverman, for example, is a very good example of this. So she's Indian. She's a member of the UK Parliament for the Conservative Party. She's probably one of the only people that's on the right that's actually a Tory at this point.
Yeah.
She had a controversial op-ed that she published a few months ago titled, "I Will Never Be English." And what she was getting at is that she's ethnically Indian, but and so she recognized that she would never be ethnically English, but she did say that there are values and beliefs that she, as ethnically Indian, wanted to be a part of.
Yeah.
So she, for example, will defend the British Empire.
Yeah.
She's been attacked for this, but she's defended the British Empire. She's also defended the British colonization of India, and was like, no, she thinks that it was a good thing.
Yeah.
And I tend to agree with her.
She thinks
that.
it was a net positive. Yeah.
What I'm getting at is that you can find instances anywhere in the world of people that might ethnically belong to a certain tribe that might actually want to discard that tribe's cultures and customs and traditions and join another tribe's cultures and customs and traditions.
Well, I mean,
and while they're not ethnically a member of that other tribe, they still nonetheless, for whatever reason, want to be a part of that tribe's cultures and traditions. But what I think we've realized in the era of mass migration is that the number of people that want to do that is very, very small compared to the number of people that would want to move because they're economic migrants and they're basically getting free money.
Yeah.
And that's where you're getting that clash of civilizations, because in the era before mass migration, the people that were immigrating, they might have recognized, I can't become English in the same sense that I can't become Japanese, but I can certainly appreciate and cherish the cultures and traditions of this land and want to be a part of that.
You could become an American. Like that was a genuine thing. You could become an American. You could, and it was one of the things, there was the reason why they talk so much about the melting pot being America, and the reason why the left hates that concept so much is because there was—
They now call it a salad.
Yeah, it was an integration, right? There was an integration where you were going to adopt certain civic, nationalist, and cultural traits that were American. But you didn't have to throw out the food you like to eat. You didn't have to throw out the music you like to listen to.
There are certain elements that when you bring it, you're enhancing, you're bringing certain elements of beauty from your culture, certain elements of food. I mean, I love diversity when it comes to food, you know? And so, and that's one of the things I do love about immigration is that we get to experience
but
food
you know what?
from everywhere.
The left now says that's why you have to have open borders and mass migration, because otherwise you can't have the food. And so now the counter argument on the right is, well, we have the recipes now. but
I was just going to say, there is an element of our culture that is unique to American culture or our system, because obviously they want to leave their economic situation that their culture produced behind and come and join in with our economic culture. And so there are certain, I mean, your culture isn't just one thing. It's kind of this, there's a lot of different moving parts to a culture. Well, one of those things would be our economic culture promotes certain things. So then when you have people come who want to overthrow our economic culture, that's when we get more frustrated, like wanting to bring their socialist ideas over here and things like that.
So on the economic front, I've got a couple stories that I want to go through that explain the divide that's now emerged between the US and India. So one of the issues, we were talking about culture a lot. We talked about tariffs. On the economic front, one of the issues that's popped up lately is, we were talking about mass migration. Well, the new wave of Indian immigrants to the US are very different than the older wave, who we were talking about earlier, wanted to become a part of that American story. You look at some of the immigrants that we're taking in now, and they're doing things like this. So there was this story a few weeks ago in Florida of, I believe it was actually an illegal immigrant from India who was, lo and behold, given a driver's license by the state of California, a commercial driver's license. And he made an illegal U-turn on a highway in Florida, and he's driving an 18-wheeler, and he's blocking the entire road doing the U-turn. Well, cars run into the 18-wheeler that's blocking the entire road, and he killed 3 people.
Or not a family, but 3 people.
And this is actually, I have one story here, but this has actually happened now several times.
This is actually a problem with, and it doesn't matter which culture it is. What it is you have folks come here.
No, this is the example, the mass migration portion of it.
Exactly. But it's a problem across the board is what I'm trying to say is when you come from a country where you do have laws on the books, but you don't really pay attention to them when it comes to the road.
Yeah. And
you have a lot of things that are just, you do whatever you got to do on the road. No one really listens. You're not really going to go to jail for this.
Can I say right now, driving in Bangladesh, which again used to be a part of India.
And you've been there, haven't you?
I haven't been to India. I've been to Bangladesh. It's a nightmare. Like traffic laws, Traffic laws in those portions of the country are just not
running red lights, turning when you're not supposed to,
everybody
cutting
honking
people
their
off.
horn.
Mhm.
But I mean, more recently, literally, I just had this happen a couple of days ago, and I was blowing a gasket over it because I was so mad. Because I don't mind people immigrating here. I just want them to respect our laws, and especially the laws of the road.
That right there explains a huge chunk of the divide that previously didn't exist. Part of the reason that we were starting to have closer relations with India after the Cold War was a combination of several factors. One was the Indian immigrants that were coming to the US integrated, were very successful.
Yeah.
The other one was India started to adopt more free market reforms. We actually had a Y-minute on this a few years ago. So on paper, India has a lot of potential economically, and their economy is growing quite rapidly. But for a long time, I mean, and it still is a very poor country. They're trying to get into that middle income bracket. But for a long time, they were arguably trapping themselves in poverty because they were adopting very centrally planned, very socialist style economics. They had something called the license Raj, where it took years to start a business. They would have like guys in government office buildings with just stacks of like forms that people were filling out from a decade ago. And, the clerks that were supposed to be approving this stuff.
It was a joke.
It was like the DMV ran everything.
It was a Soviet style, like Byzantine bureaucracy that made it impossible to start a business.
Well, a lot of that is still in place. India did start to get rid of some of it once their economy just fully imploded in the early 1990s. They basically defaulted. The economy collapsed. And one of the conditions in exchange for things like bailouts was you're going to stop doing the centrally planned stuff, at least to a small degree. And so that led to closer relations. And then the positive form of interactions with certain Indians that wanted, like you said earlier, that wanted to become an American, that led to a positive side too. Well,
there's also, I mean, you've talked about this before too. I had always had, for lack of a better term, kind of a favorable, I had always wanted closer relationships between the United States and India because I thought it would serve as a bulwark against China. And
geopolitically, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden, and again, my impression had always been that there were, that was a general sentiment, right? Lately, though, I'm seeing a lot more negativity from a cultural standpoint. So again, there's the geopolitical, right? There's the real politique and everything else. But then part of what makes an alliance work is kind of shared cultural appreciation, or at least not animosity. And I'm starting to see a lot more animosity now. And you've said that some of this comes when you have instances like this where, somebody that's in the country potentially illegally that gets a driver's license in California and then kills people in Florida by not following the roads. That's problematic. You also see this issue with respect to
India cozying up with our geopolitical enemies.
But there's, again, we'll get into India's perspective on this and why they did it. But I think the other side too, it has to do with, India is now on the internet in a way that it has never been before. You also have the cultural perspective. Like if you look at some of the, if you're going to talk about scammers, right? Online scammers, email scammers, and stuff like that. There's two things that almost always come up as kind of like a colloquial thing. One is the Nigerian prince email, right? Everyone's got the Nigerian prince. Oh, my friend, I'm going to send you $10,000 and you just give me your bank account so I can put it in there, and then you get ripped
And the
off,
other one
right?
is Indian tech support.
And the other one is the Indian component. And again,
I have to play this.
Yeah, there's a clip right. There's a clip right. Go ahead and explain the story.
I don't think Nick or Tina know what this channel is. So there's this channel called Kit Boga. He has like 3.5 million followers on YouTube. And what he does, he's so good at this. What he does is he scams scammers. He'll waste their time, like 6 hours.
I love that. I love watching him do that. I've seen women. There's a woman that does it too, and she's hilarious.
And he's like high tech about it. So he'll use like a voice changer. He'll create this like whole backstory, and then he'll like pretend, he'll fall for the scam all the way to the end.
Is he the one that triangulates them and like figures out exactly where they are?
Sometimes he'll do stuff like that.
That's a different guy than this guy.
What he does a lot is he'll use like voice changers. He'll come up with these elaborate backstories. He'll fall for the scam. And it'll usually be like, we accidentally deposited more money into your account. You now need to pay us. First off, they didn't deposit anything, and they want you to send your whole bank account to them.
Yeah.
And so he'll be like, oh, okay, I'll go buy some Google Play cards at the store. And so he'll pretend to like drive to the store. He has like all these like background noises that they hear on the call to make it sound like that he's going through this process. It's like a 6-hour long
Yeah, so
adventure.
he's wasting 6 hours of their time.
And then at the end of it, he'll just redeem everything he bought for himself.
Yeah.
And they're like watching him on screen. So watch that. It's hilarious. This is a clip from a video that got something like 11 million views. Oh, and I just realized apparently we don't have.
I'm redeeming the card. I'm redeeming the cards. Okay. No. What? Your phone is breaking up, honey. What are you trying to say?
I will redeem it. I will redeem it. I will redeem it.
All right, 3x.
I will redeem it.
E3x. 7G9K. 48.
Hello. Hey, you old.
Explain what's going on here.
All right, so pause it real quick. So again, he has used this voice of like this kind of like elderly woman and whatnot, and what's ended up happening is they've gone through this entire process where they have convinced this woman that what she needs to, my voice is coming over the speaker now. Okay, she's convinced this woman to go out and buy all these Google cards, and the purpose is for them to get the money, for them to get the codes, and for them to redeem it. And so as they're trying to walk this guy through this, who they think is an old elderly woman that doesn't understand,
Right.
he's now saying, oh, okay, I'm redeeming it now. Do not redeem. Like that's why he's like yelling, because this has been like, this is the payoff for the scammer, right? The payoff for the scammer.
And they waited like 6 hours for this.
They have finally gone through this entire process, and now they're going to finally get the payoff. Like, okay, I'm redeeming it. And he's just losing his crap.
And so do not redeem has become an internet meme.
Yeah.
Like,
That's funny.
like when stories about Twitter was filled with this, like when Trump was announcing, the tariffs and stuff like that. Like there were so many people that were like, America's redeeming.
Yeah. So if you look at all of these things together, right? So if to kind of close the loop on framing all of this, we've been on a track now for a couple of decades on improved relationships with India. Hopefully greater trade relations. There had been a generally positive idea of there hadn't been animosity toward like India the way that Americans might have had animosity toward Russia or toward Iran or toward China or anything like that. So there was this opportunity now. What Christian's pointing out, and this is important, is the problems that we're seeing now, the animosity that is starting to take place is not just geopolitical. It is increasingly becoming cultural. Okay. And that is contributing to this. Now, when we go into, we're going to look at the perspectives of India. We're going to look at the perspectives of kind of Russia and China on this. And then we're going to finish off with the perspective of the United States, which we've already discussed a little bit. From India's perspective, right? If you want to, if China is one of your biggest enemies, even though you're part of BRICS, if China is still one of your like geopolitical competitors, so you got China on one side, second biggest country in the world, nuclear power, much larger economy than yours, much stronger military, theoretically, overall. You've got Bangladesh on one side, which is also problematic relations. You got Pakistan, which is Pakistan and India have been in several like hot clashes, like people shooting each other, people beating each other, like terrorist attacks, everything. You would think that closer relationship with the United States would be in their best interest as well. And Modi seemed to be, so why would India make the decision to do things that would sour that relationship? And there's a couple of reasons for it that from India's perspective kind of makes sense. One is they have to develop. And in order to develop, you need cheap energy, right? Western countries can play around with this idea of, oh, we're going to do everything through solar and wind because we're wealthy enough to play make-believe on fossil fuels and energy prices fuel a modern economy. And India needs a lot more of it right now if they're going to expand. Like to give you an idea, the vast majority of people that live in rural areas in India, I don't even think they don't even have indoor plumbing. which causes some other issues that we'll get to in a minute. So Russia is at a point right now where they have to sell energy to whoever is willing to buy it from them, and they're willing to sell it at an incredibly low cost. So India, from a realpolitik perspective, is okay. I could buy oil from other places, but Russia's going to give it to me at far reduced prices. I do have a historic relationship with Russia, and I get that the West is mad at Russia right now because of Russia invading Ukraine, but that's not really my problem. My problem is, how do I get cheap oil? So when they're like, okay, look, we're not endorsing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We're just saying we want cheap oil. They're willing to pay it. In fact, they're willing to give it me cheaper than they normally would because you're not buying it in Europe, because you're not buying it in the West. Then I'm going to make the problem that you have with them to my advantage. And if you're looking at India, who has no real relationship with Ukraine and doesn't really care about what Russia is doing geopolitically in some of these other areas, why wouldn't they buy cheap oil from Russia?
There's a second geopolitical component, which is actually the immigration front, because one of increasingly a very large source of revenue for a lot of countries is remittances.
Yes.
And that also applies to India just as much as it does
so to give
Latin
it
America.
Again, just to explain remittances for people that don't know, remittances when someone from your country works overseas and then is sending a sizable part of their income back to India.
And
back to
there's a huge, there's a debate going on right now within the Republican Party, but there is a very large and growing segment of the GOP that is saying we need to get rid of the H-1B program. That's going to hurt India more than any other country because India receives the vast majority of H-1Bs. H-1Bs are effectively, it's a way for a company to say, I can't find talent to fill this job role here in the United States. I'm going to bring somebody from elsewhere in the world to work at my company, and they're going to live in the United States to work at my company. Now, this program was set up like 30 years ago, and it was very small. Now it's massive, and it's leading to a huge backlash because there's stories like, for example, I don't have the link for it, but there was a story from just a few weeks ago of Microsoft laying off 9,000 American employees, American citizens, at the same time that they were applying for thousands of H-1B job openings. Yeah. And so there's a large chunk of Americans particularly within the Republican Party that's looking at this and saying, this is just a scam to import foreign workers to displace American workers in their own country. As cheap labor, because you can't switch jobs as an H-1B. And so the other argument too is that this is almost like a form of indentured servitude because you cannot leave the job. You're not an American citizen. You're only given a visa to come here to work for that specific company. So you've lost your ability to negotiate with that company. You've lost your ability to change your job. And if you quit your job or leave or get fired, you have to leave the country. So you're just going to be very loyal to that company. Yeah. So companies love H-1Bs. So there's a huge chunk within the Republican Party. I know Stephen Miller's talked quite a lot about this. I know Eric Schmidt in Missouri talked about this.
It's not just the H-1Bs too. It's also taxing remittance payments.
Well, the whole reason that the H-1B is relevant is because it's something like 70% of H-1Bs are Indian citizens. And a huge chunk of the H-1B recipients that are coming to work in, say, Silicon Valley for tech companies or work in Seattle for say, Microsoft, are sending a portion of that money back to India. Yeah. And the exchange rate there is very favorable for people in India. So on the economic front, that's something else that India is not at all happy about is if we got rid of H-1Bs or restricted remittances, because remittances also hurt the United States from the perspective of it's another form of us exporting dollars. It's adding to the Triffin dilemma. It's another version of us exporting dollars to the rest of the world that then make us less competitive at home. So if we tackled remittances or H-1Bs, let alone both of those, that hurts India more than any other country.
The U.S. is the biggest trade partner for India, which is fascinating because we're a country, we're an ocean apart, right? It's that you would think it would be someone closer. But so if you look at it from that perspective, the other thing that the United States did is they were in the midst of trade negotiations where they were hoping to get down to like 15% tariffs. That kind of collapsed. There was a problem. Other countries were willing to give more favorable trade deals than India was. The United States wanted more access to their agricultural markets, which is very politically sensitive for India. And so the end result is Trump kind of got tired of negotiating and imposed a 25% tariff. And so India at that point felt as if, okay, this is turning sour. When they started buying Russian oil, Trump put on another 25%. So that really, the whole economic relations with India is in a bad shape, again, from India's perspective. The other thing too that's more geopolitical and less trade associated is when you had the latest bit of hostility between Pakistan and India, and you had a terrorist attack, you had Modi's response to it. Trump then advertised himself as negotiating the ceasefire. Modi did not respond well to that because Modi has been seen as more of a strongman in India, as sticking up for Indian culture and Indian nationality and Hinduism and pushing back against Islamic terrorism coming from Pakistan. And so for Trump to put himself in the position of negotiating that ceasefire, playing a predominant role, Modi thought it undercut him with his own population, with his own voting bloc. So now you've got to look at it. If you're in India's perspective and you're Modi right now, you're like, okay, trade deals aren't going the way I wanted. Trump took credit for something. And again, it may be that Trump did play a vital role in negotiating that ceasefire, but it still made Modi feel like he appeared weak, right? So if Modi is advertising himself as I am a strong defender of India, right, and he's seeking closer ties with Trump, and now this latest narrative is undercutting him with his own base, that's going to cause a cooling of relationships between Modi and Trump. So Modi's saying, okay, the trade deal isn't going the way it wanted. Trump's undercut me with respect to me appealing to my own base and who I represent in India. I need to develop economically, and Russia's willing to offer me a whole lot of really, really cheap oil. I'm going to take that deal. Now Trump puts on another 25% tariff on top of that. This further punishes Modi, but Modi probably feels he is in a position now where if I capitulate, I lose my status as the strong man defending India. And so what does that leave me? Well,
that's how you get articles like this.
That's how you get it. We're at DEFCON 1. India bruised by U.S. tariffs cozied up to Russia and China. Again, India has already historically had a close relationship with Russia. They've had a hostile one toward China.
But now it's warming up.
Because, well, China and Russia both also have a hostile relationship with the United States. So the issue from India's perspective is they're starting to see more tangible benefits coming out of Russia and improved relationships with China than they are improved relationships with the United States. And if I'm looking at it purely from that perspective, I get why they're making the decisions they are. Right? I'm going to have better trade relationships with the United States, but politically it's less feasible because they want more access to our agricultural markets. And the biggest thing that I want right now is cheap energy. Well, then it makes more sense to do business with Russia than it does to worry about angering the United States. Now we'll see how that plays out because again, 50% tariffs on Indian goods puts them in a more difficult position. And interestingly enough, and
Trump has more cards to play.
Yes.
I mean, I brought up remittances and H-1Bs. If he plays, I mean, that's like going nuclear at that point, right?
Yeah.
But if he plays those two cards, it would probably totally blow up the relationship, but that would very negatively impact India.
And the important part of what we're talking about now, India's perspective, is I'm not necessarily defending India's perspective. I just think it should be properly understood that what Modi is doing right now is not stupid or irrational or there's a lot of practical reasons why he's starting to make these decisions. Again, if Modi was someone that had not advertised himself as being like a strong defender of,
Hindu nationalism
and everything else, he might be able to capitulate on some of this and get away with it. But because of the way he's positioned himself domestically in India, he has to at least push back and say, okay, I can't show up to the table with my hat in hand. I have to be able to get something in order to offer something. And so cozying up to Russia and China, kind of reevaluate from his perspective, adds different cards to the bet.
The irony in all this is that Trump and Modi originally had a good relationship because they viewed each other as their own country's counterpart. It was the idea that Trump was America first and Modi was India first, and that they were both populist on the right who promoted nationalism in the context of each own country. Trump is, usually identified as an American nationalist, and Modi's identified as a Hindu or Indian nationalist. And so they got along because of that. But ironically, that's one of the things that's torpedoing the relationship, because if one party is America first, and I'm glad that Trump wants to be that, but then the other party is India first. Well, what happens when the best interests of the United States and the best interests of India clash is the two governments clash.
Yeah.
And there's less incentive to find common ground or work something out, because it's, well, you've staked your identity and your politics around not caving in, right? Not negotiating.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that means that we made a mistake or that they made a mistake. It's just that, look, at the end of the day, when you look at geopolitics, you're not going to be friends with everybody.
Yeah.
And in the case of Russia and China, we already know that, right? Like, Russia has plenty of enemies. China has plenty of enemies. And so they're both all too eager to cozy up with India as well, because I'll take China as an example here. So we know that China has...
Well, let's move it. We've kind of discussed the Indian perspective. Let's move into the Russia and China perspective.
Okay. So in the case of China, we know that China has its eyes on Taiwan. We know that China has pretty terrible relations with South Korea, with Japan, obviously with Taiwan, with Vietnam, with the Philippines and the South China Sea, with the territorial dispute with the islands down there. I mentioned Vietnam just a second ago. A lot of people don't realize that Vietnam and China are both communist states who do not like each other. Yeah. They actually fought a war with each other back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And historically, China didn't get along with India either. So China only had one friend who they also didn't get along, and that was Russia.
Yeah.
And so China just has no geopolitical allies to speak of in its backyard. Like, you can say, oh, they're friends with Brazil or they're friends with South Africa, but they have nobody in their backyard that they're friends with. And now they have a country that's coming along that's looking for friends because they're in this diplomatic dispute and arguably cultural dispute with the United States. And so if you're the perspective of China, you're wondering, you know, are some rocks in the Himalayas more valuable than shoring up your southern flank and having a partner that you don't have to worry about as we're looking to expand our influence in the South China Sea, in the Straits of Taiwan? China has to be thinking like, this is almost like a dream come true, right? It's like, I had this problem where I was isolated, and now I have this out where an emerging great power has an incentive to become friends with me. And yeah, that's not going to solve like the territorial dispute. I'm sure they're going to keep beating each other with sticks in the Himalayas, right?
Well, here we go.
Ancient tradition. But
here's what I'll also say with China. From China's perspective, they are certainly favorable to any country cooling relations with the United States. That doesn't mean China and India are becoming best buds anytime soon. There's too many cultural differences. There's too many, ancient hostilities. The other thing too is that India's economy is not conducive to what China needs. What China needs is people to buy their products. And India doesn't have, one day they can have a ton of people to buy the products, but right now India's impoverished, right? India is a fraction of the economy that China is. So India is in a better position to compete with China than it is to engage in the sort of trade that would replace someone like the United States.
They're definitely not a suitable replacement.
No. And so I think China's perspective on this is, look, we're happy with any country to have bad relations with the United States. And if that theoretically means that we can have warmer relations or slightly better relations, or at least we can have somebody that we have a common enemy with, I think that's beneficial to China's long-term strategic strategy, especially if they want to start getting serious about BRICS again and creating an alternative to the US dollar with respect to reserve currency.
That's what they want, is multipolarity.
Yes.
And so if India has broken ties with the US, and India wants to be its own pole anyway, they want to be a great power. They're aspiring to become one. China obviously wants to become, they are a great power, but they want to get rid of the, they also, we talked a lot about the post-war order, and people have different reasons for wanting to get rid of it all around the world, including within the US.
Yeah.
China's reason is very straightforward, right? The United States is a hegemonic superpower, and there's only one pole in the world, and it's centered in Washington. We want there to be a minimum of 2 poles in the world, and we want one of those poles to be in Beijing. Well, India wants to be a pole too. So there's a shared interest in the sense of they both want multipolarity. They want to disrupt the existing geopolitical status quo where you have the US-led liberal international or the rule, what Keir Starmer always calls the rules-based order.
Yeah, yeah.
They don't want that.
I have a question about that. And that is, we know that birth rates have fallen for most countries
Outside of Africa,
around the world. Right. And India used to be known for its high birth rate. They had in the 50s a 5.7 live births per, woman birth rate, which is definitely way above replacement, and now they've dropped to under 2% now. And just like so many others, and China's having a birth rate problem too. We're also having a birth rate problem, but we're also importing people. So how does that play into trying to become a superpower while you're shrinking? You're basically shrinking and you're too racist. Now, here's the thing. We have India is very racist. China is extremely racist. They absolutely
Their
are.
comedians joke about it.
Yeah, they're very racist. Korea's very racist. Across the board.
Tina, everybody's racist but the West.
Well, a lot of these countries, we like to imagine America. Well, the left likes to imagine America as being this racist monster, but honestly, a lot of these countries that they do not allow any outside immigration. And
I just love that she says like the quiet part out loud.
Yeah.
Well, okay, but they are very racist, and so there is this idea of they're not going to readily open up their borders and start importing people. I see what you mean.
They don't want to go multicultural.
Right, and because it is so
China
important,
definitely doesn't want to be multicultural.
China, Japan,
I don't think they're ever going to be like, we want to bring in a bunch of Nigerian immigrant. Like they're
the
not
point I'm
going to do
making
that.
is it's very important within their cultures to marry within their culture, and it's very frowned upon to pull someone from outside the culture for marriage, let alone opening up your borders and importing them into your country. And now their birth rate is falling, and it's fallen off a cliff. In 50 years, your birth rate is a third of what it used to be, or a fourth of what it used to be. It was almost 6 live births.
Yeah.
And so you have just catastrophically.
So you think
cut
they've missed
your
the
knees
boat
out.
in the sense that they didn't actually get to superpower or great power
they're
status?
trying to superpower. Okay, so
How does this impact from the Chinese perspective?
So the question, no. The question I had is, how do these birth rates between these countries and their
Because they both
ability
have
to
really
work
low birth
together,
rates.
Yeah.
Given that they're not going to use alternative methods, how do they accomplish that?
It's a much bigger problem. So here's the deal. From China's perspective, it's a much bigger problem for them because they're at a massive declining birth rate. And at this point, it's
too late.
It's somewhat irreversible, right? It's going to hit the way it is, and they don't have the sort of economic conditions where they can incentivize people to just have children. India is down to a 1.98, which is still higher than the United States. And because they have so many people and so much development to go, I don't think it impacts them the same way as quickly as what China is going to experience. The question will really come into play is this. Provided that India can stay close to replacement rate, which it is right now, it's close to replacement rate, they maintain a population of roughly 1.4 billion, whereas China's looking to lose about 500 million people, I think, by the end of the century.
There is one other caveat I'd like to make on that.
That's fine, but let me finish this. That means that now all of a sudden China finds itself in a position where they have a nuclear power neighbor that is hostile to them with, 600 million more people than they do. And that does pose a strategic risk for them.
Mm-hmm. I do want to highlight one other thing about the birth rate in India, and that is that the only reason their birth rate is where it is because the rural areas still have a high birth rate. Mm-hmm. There is a massive emphasis on career, double income, and that has just like in all these other countries, that has been kind of the death knell for the birth rate. Yeah. And so when the people who are actually breeding are your rural folks who are actually in more impoverished areas and things like that, how are they going to import people from their rural areas?
India's not going to adopt
from the rural. Well, again, the vast majority, if you look at the Indian like subcontinent. The rural areas are the vast majority of the Indian population lives along the Indus River Valley.
No, the Ganges River.
Sorry, the Ganges River Valley. So if you look at that, area, it is like an incredibly high concentration of people in a relatively small portion of the country. The subcontinent is far more sparsely populated. Now, again, I think part of the reason why, again, they're focusing on energy policy and buying oil from Russia is because they realize that they need to industrialize. They realize that they need to be able to provide more economic opportunity. Again, I think part of the reason why the agricultural tariffs were a big thing for India is because they're trying to foster their own agricultural industry, and they feel like if they have to compete with American products, that's going to stunt their own growth. We can argue about that later. That's their impression. From China's perspective, I don't think they see India as being their lifelong buddy or close ally. The cultures are too different. The strategic interests are too different. But insofar as both countries see the United States as either a bigger threat or a bigger obstacle to their geopolitical objectives, they're fine with working together or coming up with some sort of arrangement that works. And provided that both countries see some degree of power parity between each other, which means neither side's invading the other, then it makes sense for them to work together to achieve interests. What's going to be difficult is for two countries that border each other to try to establish spheres of influence, where it's like, okay, this is your sphere of influence, this is our sphere of influence. You don't play in our sandbox, we don't play in yours. I think that's very difficult. I think that's much more difficult to achieve between China and India than it is between Russia and India. So Russia and India is a very different dynamic. From Russia's perspective, they just need people to buy their oil. And if India is willing to do it, great. They will be happy to sell it to India. They will be happy to sell whatever India wants to India, right? And by the same token, it's not like there's going to be a great deal of immigration between Russia and India. So this really is more of a purely economic, purely geopolitical arrangement. Again, no deeply abiding cultural ties.
Between all three, there is not. There's really no culture.
But they all have shared interest in the form of all three of them want to become Poles.
Yeah.
All three of them have an incentive to tear down the post-war US-led international order where there's one pole. Mm-hmm. They want a multipolar world. So I really do think that we're going to see, part of me thinks this is irreversible. In large part because
let's stick with, because we're going to talk about that as kind of our conclusions, I'm sure. But again, from Russia's perspective, I see this for them as being essentially, obviously they're also members of BRICS. Mm-hmm. So they are very interested, for obvious reasons, for there being an alternative to the US dollar with respect to international trade and the reserve currency. All of this makes sense for Russia in the immediate term of just selling stuff. It also makes sense for them to essentially build closer relationships with a potential trading partner and a potential geopolitical ally, as well as a potential ally when it comes to impacting international monetary policy. So this is all a upside for Russia. Not to mention that when you look at Russia's immediate question, it's Ukraine. And so the longer they can stay in the fight, the better off their position becomes, provided they can get, again. So can we all agree that this is kind of just this is a no-brainer for Russia? It's a no-brainer. Okay. Yeah. Now when it gets into the American perspective, and we talked about this a little bit from the cultural standpoint, is that previously I think that there was a generally positive view of Indian culture within the United States, Indian entrepreneurship, doctors.
The West broadly historically had this almost like Orientalist, mystical interpretation of India as
you saw this with the Beatles and
far off. Like one of my favorite songs, I played this when we were testing the audio in the studio, was Kashmir by Led Zeppelin. Yeah. There was this perception going back over 100 years of India being this like magical place that's filled with mysticism and mystery.
It's exotic.
And it's exotic. And for example, Erwin Schrödinger got a lot of his inspiration for his understanding of how quantum mechanics worked from the Upanishads. which are Indian
Religious
religious and philosophical texts. And he's like famous in some of his lectures as saying like, this stuff came to me because I read these texts. And Indians pride themselves on that because they will argue our metaphysics is proven by quantum mechanics. There's actually like a lot of Indian scientists that love going into physics because they're trying to prove their own worldview, not just theologically, but also just metaphysically in general. The West like has for a long time viewed India like, another example, I was telling Tina this right before we started filming the podcast. The swastika as a symbol comes out of the Indian subcontinent, and the West adopted it over a century ago, long before the Nazis were a thing. And then the Nazis came along and appropriated it from a Western context, and now you don't see it at all in the West, obviously, but you still see it in India. Like that's another example of almost like a cultural export, one that went sour in the West, right? But we had this idea for a long time that India was this land of like great ancient wisdom, that it was very different, but also something to admire from a distance. Well, now you can't admire it from a distance because we live in a globalized world where everybody's on the internet and everybody's moving. You have mass migration in the internet, so you can't admire anything from a distance. It's in your face.
Well, I'll give you a perfect example of this. The whole concept of street food, right? Like there's been kind of like this positive notion in the United States of street food and the taco truck and the whatever else it was, right? And then people started showing like pictures of Indian street food, and it became a caricature because you're seeing some of the most unsanitary, disgusting things you could witness online of watching people prepare food with their foot in the pot of soup,
or cutting chicken with their
toenail. So when now I don't mean to bring this up because I'm trying to characterize all Indians this way. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to say is one of the ways to sour relationships between two countries, and when you engage in practices that generate disgust. Okay, and there are two things right now that are becoming far more prevalent online that generate disgust in the West. One is this concept of sanitary conditions associated with food. The other has to do with the internet scamming.
Defrauding your grandma.
Defrauding grandma is a way, and when people associate defrauding grandma with a particular culture or place, you're going to get natural animosity as a result. Now, the good component was the idea of, again, the cultural understanding of Indian families being very strong with their families and working hard and being entrepreneurial. Even that is starting to come under attack now because of the HB1 visas, right? It's the idea, or H1B visas, because now it's seen as, well, wait a second, American people in that same industry are getting fired to make way for Indian employees who make less money. And so this isn't about America doesn't have sufficient labor or education to meet those objectives. It's about American industry, companies, and the government giving preferential treatment to cheap labor from overseas. When you add all of these components, take out the geopolitical, take out the fact that right now Trump is trying to put the squeeze on Putin because he does want to end the war in Ukraine. He doesn't want it to be an issue. He doesn't want it to be a drain on U.S. resources, and he also doesn't want it. He also wants to just shut that down for a variety of reasons that I think are both in America's interest, geopolitically interesting, and personal. I think Trump wants to be seen as a peacemaker. India buying a bunch of oil from Russia puts more money for Russia to be able to buy, military equipment from where? Iran and China, right? So part of this is trying to interrupt this cycle to be able to end the war on at least internationally recognizable, favorable terms, and to be able to move on.
Yeah.
To be able to move on. India just made that more difficult. That's the geopolitical concern for why Trump's mad. But what's going to end up happening is, now that we have a geopolitical reason to be mad at India, all of these things which exacerbate cultural ties,
it's going to be an avalanche.
They end up.
So
that's my point. Is from the American perspective, this is not going to be just about the geopolitical issue of India buying oil from Russia. Most Americans don't care about that. But if they're getting news which says India is thwarting Trump's strategy for trying to end the war in Ukraine, and they're trying to keep American companies out of India, because that'll be a part of the discussion, even though it's a little bit more complex than that. combined with the scammer channels, which is happening. This is an issue. It is a real issue. It should not be used to categorize all Indians, but it is a real issue. It's the same thing with the cultural disgust that you get to see from unsanitary conditions,
or things like this, or in the case of Canada, the story of like on the mass migration thing, when you import and that's what Canada has done. They have imported millions of Indians. When you import millions of people from one particular part of the world into your country, in a very short amount of time, you destroy assimilation, but B, you are also importing their ethno-religious or political feuds. And in the case of Canada, they've had multiple assassinations and acts of political violence taking place between Sikhs and Hindus over the Khalistan issue. This is something that the average Canadian is going to be like, I've never even heard of this. Where's Khalistan? And now it's like shoved in their face as something that they have to have an opinion on now. And so like, I think that the cultural divide was large enough that, I mean, look, the English and the Irish don't get along. And look at how similar they are in the sense that like, they're both Europeans. They both were Christian, different types of Christianity, right? But they both had a Christian tradition. They were both part of the same empire for hundreds of years. And yet they didn't get along. Now take two different groups of people from opposite sides of the world with radically different metaphysics, religion, languages, history, cultures, traditions, backstories, ways of life, all of those things. And now you've put them in the same polis basically together. The polis is just going to disintegrate because there's no shared anything for people to latch onto and say, we have this in common. Or we have that in common.
Well, and you're seeing this too. There's I linked to it. You're seeing this in Canada right now because they imported so many people in such a relatively short timeline. We're talking like a space of a couple of years. It is having an impact on things like, this is going to sound disgusting, but it is what it is. Open public defecation.
And it's stuff like that like...
Why is this? Why this is something where, again, if you're a Canadian, a society which had always prided itself on being very polite, very respectful, and
environmentalism.
And environmentalism, the whole pristine nature, the whole deal. They're now talking about this where it's like, well, yeah, there's a lot of cultural norms that these aren't considered as problematic. And now, again, I'm not trying to make too generalized a statement here, but link to this article from the National Library of Medicine.
Okay.
And it was the abstract, right? India has a far higher open defecation rates than other developing regions where people are poorer, literacy rates are lower, and water is relatively more scarce. The reason why they open with that is because the idea has been well, the reason why you have this problem in India is because of poverty. And what they look to study here, and by the way, here's the names of the people that did the study: Diane Coffey, Ashish Gupta, Payal Hatathi, Dean Spears, Nikhil Srivastava, sorry, I'm getting this one wrong, and Sangeeta Yavas. So you have a lot of people that are Indian that are actually conducting this study, right? This wasn't
I don't
the West.
have the link to the article.
It's in the notes. I
see. Okay, let me.
So this wasn't picking on India. This was trying to identify a problem and ascertain how it could be fixed. And the very first thing that they looked at was, well, this is a poverty issue, right? If you don't have sufficient sewage, if you don't have sufficient indoor plumbing, if you don't have these other components, this is going to lead to obviously this problem. And they said, okay, but we looked at other countries with similar economic. In fact, we looked at countries with poorer literacy rates, poorer economic rates, and it wasn't the same problem. Why is it a problem here? And here's one of the things that's interesting to look at. It said, perhaps the most important barrier to the adoption of affordable latrines in rural India is the unique history of untouchability and its continuing practice. Affordable latrines, such as those recommended by the World Health Organization and subsidized by the Indian government, have pits that need to be emptied manually. Rural people equate manual pit emptying with scavenging and other degrading forms of labor traditionally done by Dalits. Because of this, non-Dalits refuse to empty their own latrine pits. Dalits, who were traditionally compelled by violence and poverty to do similar work, increasingly seek alternatives to the kinds of physically and ritually dirty jobs that have been used for generations to justify their oppression, exclusion, and humiliation. This is part of the caste system. So again, you're talking about Modi, who is pushing for Hindu nationalism. Hinduism has caste systems. And so the very sort of work that is needed to do in order to address this situation is associated with untouchables. And so again, when you are getting this cultural mindset, and then when you talk to like rural men in India, it's this idea that, well, no, the cleaner and the more appropriate thing to do is for just open defecation rather than trying to manage sewage in one place. This is not just a lack of knowledge. This is not just a lack of funds or resources. There's something cultural connected to this. This is why it appears in higher degrees here than other places. It's why when you have mass importation into other areas, that cultural tradition follows. That cultural tradition is not just obviously unsanitary, but it also carries with it cultural disgust. The more instances of cultural disgust that you get from cultural clashing, the more stereotypes you're going to receive, the more generalized animosity you're going to witness. And again, this is problematic on a very practical level because not everyone believes this way or does this thing. But when the easiest cultural tie between that is, okay, you come from this place has this problem, therefore you represent this problem.
It just becomes pattern recognition.
It just becomes pattern recognition. And again, pattern recognition is valuable in some areas, but can be detrimental in others. And so I think from the American perspective, when you add all those things together, you have a recipe for ongoing bad relations in the future. Now, this leads us to our overall conclusions and what do we see happening next? I'll pose one question, Christian, I'll let you lead off. Do you think that with everything that we've just discussed and the multiple perspectives, that what we see here is that almost out of practicality and maybe necessity, there is going to be a closer alliance between Russia, China, and India that will become more formalized as in the immediate future. Let's say in the immediate future, we'll define as the next 2 decades.
I think that India doesn't necessarily want to wed itself to China or Russia, but certainly they want to be a pole, like I said earlier.
Yeah.
And so they'll use China and Russia insofar as it enables them to become their own great power in their own neighborhood, right? So in that respect, I do think that we're going to see kind of a new triple alliance in the 21st century. The original triple alliance in the late 19th, early 20th century was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy.
Yeah.
Which ultimately didn't work out for them in World War I,
so
right?
a new axis?
No, this is World War I, not World War II. The axis was Germany, Italy, and Japan, which is also a triple alliance. But I do think that you're going to see some sort of block between the three of them form. I think at this point it's kind of inevitable. I jumped at the gun earlier when I was like, I don't think that there's any way to come back from this. I think that the cultural divide was growing, and it was more and more in your face because of mass migration and the internet.
Yeah.
And I think Samuel Huntington is more correct than Francis Fukuyama, and that there are just people are not blank slates. And there are real differences between people that's expressed in ways of being and culture and actions and traditions. And as other cultures experience each other, they identify things that they don't agree with, that they don't get along with. And then when you add in a geopolitical reason for that cultural boiling up to kind of come to the surface, there's nothing holding back the emergence of basically a new friend-enemy dynamic where the West, particularly the United States, and maybe even Canada and the UK, depending on if they ever get a government change, is going to probably put an end to mass migration, and particularly from certain parts of the world where they feel like that they're culturally incompatible. And again, that doesn't mean that there's not a single person in the entire Indian subcontinent that doesn't, share similar values.
Oh, I guarantee you right now, there's somebody working really hard in New Delhi that I relate to as an American far more than I do a liberal college professor trying to trans their 9-year-old, right? Like there's no question of that. But
what's going to happen? We're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about groups.
Yep.
And we're talking about nations and civilizations and cultures. And these are much larger than just an individual. So when you're talking at scale here, not at the individual granular level, I think that you are getting into a clash of civilizations where India is going to be its own block, and China is going to be its own block, and Russia is going to be its own block, and the United States will stay a block. I'm not saying we're ever going away as a pole.
Mm-hmm.
You have some people that are like, "Oh, America's over." No, the United States is going to outlive me most likely.
Yeah.
And but I do think that a lot of this is irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
That we are getting into an environment where great power politics is coming back. You're seeing a return to more 19th century style
Mm-hmm.
geopolitics rather than post 1945 geopolitics.
Yeah.
And that the massive cultural differences that have become exacerbated by globalization, mass migration, and internet adoption around the world, combined with the existing geopolitical issues that are already there. It's not even that the tariff thing is the issue. The tariff thing is simply going to be the excuse for the much deeper divide to kind of reveal itself now.
I think I think that's correct. I think there's a couple of things that are happening in the United States right now that is lending itself not toward isolationism or anything like that, but taking a hard look at first of all, how do we use power to get what we want? And you could say, well, we've always, first of all, every country has always used power to get what they want. So I'm not singling out the United States here as like some sort of negative thing, but a lot of times what we have wanted has been kind of this esoteric concept or view of the world, as opposed to, for all the talk about no blood for oil, the United States had the military power to take as much dang oil as we wanted, and we didn't do it. We fought a huge war in Iraq and essentially didn't take any of their oil, right? We allowed them to sell it. We bought it. We poured billions of dollars into that country without, raping it of its resources or anything like that. And we didn't
turn them into a colony.
No, we didn't turn them into a colony or a territory or a vassal state or anything like that. Now, again, I'm not advocating for us to do this, but I think more Americans are like, before you get us involved in one more thing, what do we get? Because we're tired of spending a lot of money to try to improve a country or make it better or make it safer or make it wealthier.
Or make it more progressive.
Yeah, and what do we get as a result? And so the American mindset, I think, is very much switched to, we no longer buy this idea of, quote, making the world safe for democracy. If the people in Afghanistan want to live that way, do it. Now, if you hit us, if you attack us, we'll hit you back. But there's no more trying to make you into a liberal democracy. We're not interested. And so there was one thing that Trump started to do that I think Americans appreciated. So for instance, in Ukraine, like, okay, to the extent that we're going to be in Ukraine, we want mineral rights. That's always been something that on kind of this moral plane that the United States was above asking for anything, right? It was the Colin Powell quote, right? Americans have spilt blood to try to make the world safe, and all we've asked is for enough ground to bury our dead. 20 years ago, that was a really inspirational quote. Now it's like, yeah, and we're done with that, because guess what? They don't appreciate it. And there's a lot of Americans that don't feel like, so one set of Americans say, hey, we made a bunch of dumb decisions, and now they're blaming them. Oh, of course these countries hate us, all the dumb decisions you've made. There's a lot of other Americans that are like, you know what? We spilled a lot of blood and treasure trying to bring something good to the world, and they didn't appreciate it, so screw it. You don't get our blood and treasure anymore. And if you want our help, what's in it for us? And so what you see, regardless of where you might fall on those two categories, or maybe you fall somewhere in the middle, there's an increasing demand for what do we get out of it? And Trump has reflected that, not just within his military actions, but within his trade negotiations. Trump's looking at it going, we're the biggest consumer market in the world, and we're the world's reserve currency. That carries power, and instead of being embarrassed of that power, I'm going to leverage it in negotiations. And guess what? It's been working. It's been working in a lot of places. I think it's not working in India right now because we couldn't meet India's immediate demands, both, and not just economically, but politically, because political consequences always factor into this. If Modi might want to make a deal, but if he can't get reelected based off of the dynamic, that's going to take precedent over the economic deal. So right now, I think we're at a point where India's looking at it going, okay, we had hopes for closer relationships with the United States, but our own practical considerations of where we're at right now is we don't know what's going to happen with immigration and remittances. We don't know what's going to happen with H-1B visas. We don't know what's going to happen with respect to American tariffs. And if what they're demanding is more than what we can do politically at this point, the solution is find allies elsewhere. I think we're going to probably see more of that happen. I don't know what Trump could offer that Modi could accept that would look like a win for both of them. And that's always the question in geopolitical terms. It's never about it. You never beat the other side unless you can absolutely, no kidding, crush them. And we're not in a position where we're interested in crushing, India. So we have to be able to offer something they're willing to trade. And right now, I think India's looking at it going, I'd rather have cheap Russian oil and no conflict with China. And I get it. I think long term, though, I don't see BRICS being a thing. I don't see them being, I don't see those economies, in part because they're so culturally different. And because they're so, with the exception of Russia.
The only thing
China,
they have in common is a shared enemy right now.
Yeah, and South Africa is in no position to be able to play a major role. Brazil is not in a major position to be able to play a role. The three that could are India, Russia, and China. India kind of has a history of trying to keep all their options open. And some of that's cultural and theological, right? Is keeping their options open. They're not necessarily trying to make enemies out of the United States. And I don't think Trump will put us in a position to be an enemy, but he's going to play hardball. What'll be interesting to see is what happens in the immediate future. Because here's the other thing. Trump engages in realpolitik as well. Russia doesn't necessarily need or Russia doesn't necessarily want closer relationships with China and India as opposed to Europe and the United States. It's something out of necessity. And so what's going to be interesting to see take place is China and India have got a lot of problems where it puts them in a position to be more competitive with one another than cooperative. Russia's in a position where these are alliances out of necessity. China very easily could turn on Russia in ways that would be very detrimental to Russia. The only thing keeping them from doing that is nuclear weapons and the current geopolitical dynamics. If I'm Trump right now, I say the alliance between Russia, China, and India isn't significant enough to pose any sort of major geopolitical threat to me. BRICS is certainly not in a position to be able to, do this. I think the reason why he wants Russia to end the war in Ukraine is so that he can reset relations with Russia. Because if he can pull Russia more out of China and India's orbit, or especially China's orbit, well, that's just one more person on China's border that doesn't like China. So I don't see Indian-U.S. relations drastically improving anytime soon. But I think what we could potentially see within the next 2 to 3 years is the war ending in Ukraine. And look, I said this 2 years ago, and I still think it's a possibility and the reason why this goes into the whole India question is because once the war in Ukraine stops and the Ukrainians and Zelensky and Putin both accept a deal, which I think is going to include something like this: cessation of hostilities in Ukraine, some sort of agreed upon solution on the Donbass, which allows for either a referendum vote, an internationally monitored election with a referendum vote. Crimea sticks with Russia. And then what ends up happening is Zelensky gets a peace prize and literally hundreds of billions of dollars in rebuilding Ukraine, where, okay, they can say that we won, we prevented the Russian takeover of our country. Donbass is predominantly ethnically Russian. We will, because we believe in self-determination, we will allow for an internationally recognized referendum in the Donbass. Donbass will naturally have closer ties with Russia than it would the rest of the Ukraine. But Ukraine gets to save face. And oh, by the way, to sweeten the deal, here's billions of dollars in international aid in order to rebuild Ukraine. Putin will get to show that he was strong and stuck up for ethnic Russians in the Donbass. Ukraine joining NATO is probably not a thing, but Putin's also going to have to accept closer ties between Ukraine and the rest of Europe. I think he's going to have to accept that. It may not be military, but it will be trade. If that happens, well, now Russia finds itself in a new position because the rest of Europe wants Russian energy. They need it, right? Germany found out real quick, outsourcing our energy policy to a Swedish girl wasn't a good idea. No, your Swedish girl doesn't even care about you anymore. Your Swedish girl is more concerned about free Palestine at that moment, right? Because she was a leftist. The environmental thing was just convenient for her leftism at that particular point, and now Palestine's convenient for it. But there's nothing German citizens wouldn't love more than to see their own heating bills in the winter plummet because they now get access back to Russian energy again. And that can change that entire dynamic and throw off that orbit. And so I think Trump is less concerned. I think Trump is more. I think the reason why Trump was willing to destroy the trade negotiations that were taking place with India is because he's more pissed about them keeping Russia in the fight. And he doesn't want Russia in the fight. He wants it over. And I think he wants it over so he can reset relationships with Russia. And so I don't see a triple alliance forming in any sort of long-term meaningful way between the BRICS countries or specifically between India, Russia, or China. If anything, if Russia can get brought out of that circuit, and now all of a sudden Russia selling oil to India doesn't have the same implication that it does right now, because if the war's over in Ukraine, it doesn't have the same implication. The United States doesn't care. Also, the price of Russian oil will not be as cheap as it is right now, which will put India back in the position of, okay, America, I think that India and U.S. relations will probably remain more strained as long as the war goes on in Ukraine. I think when the war goes off, I think when the war ends in Ukraine, it puts the United States once again in a better position for negotiation with India. And the question will be will it be with Modi or will it be with someone else? Because the other thing that's happening is there's a lot of anti-America sentiment growing in India as well right now. And so that features into the cultural issues and the political issues that don't have as much to do with real politic and in economics, but just general sentiment, vibes. Vibes impacts politics far more than we would like to think it does. But to me, it's amazing to think how much of this is hinging on the war in Ukraine right now in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think it should. I think we got some questions from the audience, right?
There are not that many questions.
We got one question right now. Whitfield said, question, are crime rates going to be discussed? I think I think when you see something like what happened with, again, somebody, I don't know if he was in the country illegally or had a visa or whatever, but the guy that gets the commercial driver's license from California, Florida obviously recognizes a driver's license from other states and it ends up killing people in Florida. That's the sort of thing that's going to impact it even more. Crime rates in Canada have been going up as a result of immigration. And again, the crime rates that exacerbate the particular situation that we're talking about here are things when like essentially blood feuds in India follow the immigration to Western countries. So I do think that will impact it. I hope that answers your question. Another question, Loyal to Law said, does the decline of fixed marriages or arranged marriages have to do anything with the falling birth rate in India? I don't know the answer to that. There's still a lot of arranged marriages in India.
I think the bigger aspect is not necessarily, maybe that has a bearing on it, but really there's a cultural shift toward economic success, which requires both parents to be heavy.
They're trying to develop.
They're trying to develop, and so both parents have to be heavily educated and have to go and work outside the home, which makes it very difficult to have children and actually raise your children. And so during the time when a woman would be getting educated and establishing her career, happens to also be during the most fertile years of her life.
Well, I think
when you have something where they're really kicking it down the road, I mean, you think about this. Six babies per live birth almost in the 50s to now under 2 per person.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the elderly population and how top heavy that is going to become on their system, same situation you have going on in some of these other countries where the elderly are just, they have huge numbers, whereas your young working folks are much more sparse now.
Well, and I think the other issue too, that when you see with arranged marriages in a culture like that is, it's not, I don't think it's the arranged marriages which dictate the birth rate. It's the people who are engaging in the arranged marriages. So for instance, if I'm someone that, so let's say I'm in a portion of India which still utilizes arranged marriages as an important tradition, cultural tradition. And I'm someone that is very, very education and economic oriented, and I want my son or my daughter to marry someone that also reflects the same values. Then what you're going to do is you're going to have an arranged marriage between 2 families which emphasize the economic and the educational over large families. Again, a big part of the reason why in the rural areas you still have larger families is because it's largely agricultural. And so when it's largely agricultural, children are seen as people that assist on the farm or assist with agricultural pursuits far more so than somebody that's engaged in law or
some
medicine.
Some of it would be by choice for their particular economic reasons.
Yeah. This was a big thing too that happened in Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh is the size of Iowa. It has 180 million people and it floods annually, right? Like it's an incredibly poor country, but children. They did a study for a while where they were trying to end child labor in Bangladesh, and what they found is that if they ended it, like I forget what percentage of families would essentially starve as a result. And so it's important to understand that in some of these countries, children are considered an economic advantage to the family, whereas in higher income societies, children generally present an economic an economic burden. They provide benefits in other ways, but an economic burden. And so it's important to keep that dynamic in mind.
Nick wasn't lying. It is the size of Iowa.
Yeah, it's roughly the size of Iowa. Okay, there's another question here.
Could you imagine Iowa having over 100 million people?
Oh, no, it'd be nuts. Procyon said, question, would a multipolar world be better for the United States as it will force us to focus more on geopolitical interests rather than, say, regime building or economic aid, more of a focus on trade relations? So I don't know that a multipolar world automatically achieves that. So for instance, when we were in a bipolar world, no pun intended, between the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in a lot of foreign aid because it was a bulwark against the Soviet Union. I think what ends up, so I don't know that a multipolar world necessarily leads to less foreign engagement for what we might call reasons other than just direct economic benefit. When you see a multipolar world as other countries presenting a credible military threat against yourself, there ends up being more of a desire to make sure that you keep countries in your sphere of influence as opposed to their sphere of influence. And the easiest way to do that is to hand out money. And that's what the U.S. strategy was all throughout the Cold War.
A multipolar world is what has existed for all of history until 1945. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can go, okay, maybe with a brief period for a 10-year period after Alexander conquered the Persians, there was a unipolar. Well, I mean, even then you still had China.
Even then, you can't really compare it to today because international travel and military technology was nowhere near what it is. Yeah.
You probably can't go further back with these concepts of polarity any further back than, say, Napoleon. That's probably, and even then you might be stretching it, but like you had the Napoleonic Wars where there was a multipolar world for sure between Britain and France. Some other great powers as well, Prussia, Austria, Russia. Then you had the Concert of Europe, where there's still, I mean, and the imperial era too, the 19th century in general, is the United Kingdom was the dominant pole, but there were still rival power blocks emerging. The United States was developing in that time period. We became the largest economy in the world in the 1890s. The German Empire unified after the Franco-Prussian War, and they certainly identified as a pole. And then by the time you get to World War I, that's like the first of two back-to-back conflicts where it was kind of determining who's going to be the primary pole. And twice Germany attempted to achieve that status and failed both times.
And if we're honest too, like Bismarck didn't want to. Bismarck wanted to maintain parity within Europe.
He wanted a multipolar balance.
Yeah, here's what you see different about any other period in history. You had two revolutions that took place that completely upended what used to be the case. What used to be the case is you had strong regional powers. So the Roman Empire didn't really have much of a peer in most of its empire, but you had Persia. Persia ended up being something of a peer against the Roman Empire. But they had their respective regions, right? And then they fought over the land in between, the Levant, what's modern day Turkey or Anatolia.
Mesopotamia.
Mesopotamia, all of those areas. And that largely kind of stayed in place, right? You had China as a regional power. You had, various points, Japan as a regional power. You had,
believe it or not, at some points in the past, India with the Mughal Empire.
Yeah, you had India as a regional power. And the reason why they were regional powers is because prior to the Industrial Revolution, and then prior to what we might call the high-tech revolution that took place, if you wanted to get to one of these places, it was a 3-month boat ride, right? Like this was...
Yeah, and that dynamic just doesn't exist anymore, which means we're kind of going into uncharted territory.
We are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know we've got to wrap up, so I'm going to ask you to
I'll give kind of like the final wrap up. I think after everything we discussed is that I think what you're going to see is going to be interesting and somewhat unique. I do believe the United States, at least for the foreseeable future, remains the overall military and economic superpower, both by virtue of our productive capacity, but also by virtue of the fact that we're the world's reserve currency. I think you're going to continue to see that. Now, as the United States becomes less interested, let's say, in getting involved in regional conflicts or making the world safe for democracy, I do see more of a realpolitik coming back into play, where the question of the countries that do have the ability, either through economic power, military power, or a combination of the two, ask more questions along the lines of what's in it for us. I do think you're starting to see a backlash against mass immigration, too, that's also going to have implications with a lot of these countries. To answer the question of today, which is what's going to happen between the United States and India, I think you will continue to see a cooling of relations between the two countries because India's immediate needs are best met by, I think, Russia, and the United States doesn't have a great deal of immediate needs from India. This is not to say that the tariffs are not going to impact our markets. They will. There'll be negative impacts on our markets as a result of 50% tariffs on India. I don't know that 50% tariffs on India are going to be enough to get them to stop buying Russian oil. And so what ends up happening is I think those relations cool until the war in Ukraine is settled. That's going to be my prediction. When the war in Ukraine is settled, I think a couple of things take place. One, oil going to India doesn't become as cheap, but it's still going to be there, and we don't care if they buy it from Russia. I think we're back in a better negotiating position with respect to trying to get India to lower some of its tariffs while we correspondingly lower ours as well, but we allow for more agricultural inroads into India. I do think that you're going to see in the interim probably a backlash against H-1B visas and immigration from India, which is going to impact the tech sector most. And so I think you're going to potentially see higher costs associated there. But I don't think it's going to be so much so that American consumers are just furious and, refusing to buy technology. What you could also see is more American workers operating within that sector now that they don't feel like they have to compete with H-1B visas. And so that's some of the dynamics that I think you're going to see taking place. I still maintain that it's in the United States' best interest to foster positive relationships with India. I just think it's going to take a while. And again, it'll be interesting to see what next steps India takes. But long term, I just don't see a close alliance between Russia and China forming this multipolar world where they're able to compete with U.S. economic and military power. So That's my once over the world. What do you guys think? Let us know within the comments. Also, let us know what other issues you might like us to tackle in the future. We also want to thank Ground News for once again sponsoring that episode. Again, we regularly use Ground News to search for the various articles that we need in order to be able to provide you a good comprehensive analysis of everything that is going on within the topics that we bring to bear. So definitely go over to groundnews.com/MTA and check out that the deal they got, 40% off. You're going to get the full range of features on Ground News and be able to get that good information. Also, if you would like to be a part of the conversation as we're filming, asking questions and getting them answered, check out the link in the description. Consider joining our community. We love to be able to answer questions. Plus, there's a lot of other benefits for joining that community as well. We do our monthly meetups. We also do our different chats on Circle. We've even got a Minecraft Discord. Come on over, check it out. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.